All right, students. So this week we're going to be talking about sexual behaviors. Okay? Um, and the book goes through all the different types of sexual behaviors, which is what I'm doing now as well. Okay? So first, let's start with what's called sexual fantasy. We're all probably familiar with the idea of like fantasies or sexual fantasies. Many individuals will, think about or envision or create images of these sexual fantasies or have certain sexual fantasies that they play in their mind. There's one thing I really, really want you to understand though, is that sexual fantasy does not always mean that the person wants it in reality. Oftentimes, fantasies just stay in our heads. They're just fantasies. It doesn't mean just because someone has a sexual fantasy, it doesn't mean that they want it to become a reality. It's really just a sexual fantasy for some people. Now, some people may want it to be a reality, but that's not an assumption that we should be making about sexual fantasies, okay? If you watch Friends, all right, there's the episode of the sexual fantasy of Ross when he tells Rachel that it's the, Leia, Princess Leia in the golden bikini from Star Wars, okay? And that's a funny episode, and maybe that's a common thing for a lot of guys. I don't know, but as far as like the fantasy, he may not have wanted it to be reality. He may have wanted it to be a reality, okay? But it's really just a fantasy for many individuals, and the fantasy can be anything from just fantasizing about, people like your partner or someone else like kissing you or holding you, and it could be other things as well. The book lays out like some statistics from some research about like some common fantasies that are similar between men and women, and then some common fantasies that are not that similar between men and women. All right, check that out. But the main key thing I want you to know is that sexual fantasies do not have to become a reality. Also, sexual fantasies can actually be very good for people. Oftentimes there's a stigma against sexual fantasies, but sharing one's sexual fantasies can create intimacy and closeness within the relationship. Again, it's not about creating the fantasy, but sharing the fantasy can do that. Okay? Next is another sexual behavior that is highly common is masturbation. Now, there's a lot of stigma against masturbation, but there's also a lot of people doing it, okay? We avoid talking about it, but it is happening for sure, okay? There's mutual masturbation between partners. There's solo masturbation for one individual. There's masturbation while one partner watches, okay? There are many different ways of using that sexual behavior of masturbation. Now, what's really interesting is, we don't really talk about this that often in society, but there's actually a long-standing history of trying to control like males' sexual desire, especially about masturbation. All right, there's all these myths or ideas that float around masturbation, like you'll go blind. You've probably heard that. If you masturbate too much, you'll go blind. There is, you could have severe gastrointestinal issues. You could, your mind can go and basically like dementia would set in from too much masturbation. All these different like ailments that were created very specifically by the church in order to try to control male masturbation. Because people back then, when they were, coming up with these ideas, they didn't believe that women masturbated. They didn't believe women even enjoyed sex, okay? So it was really about controlling male masturbation. And even here in the United States, we have a long-standing history of this too. Circumcisions were actually started. The circumcision started in the States were originally started to control male masturbation and male sexuality. We have graham crackers. You could read this in the book. But graham crackers. So Dr. Graham created graham crackers, which was actually originally created as a dense, unnutritious food that could be fed to little boys in like growing teenagers because it would help lower their sexual drive, and therefore they will not masturbate. Yeah, sit on that a little bit. Okay, so we had circumcision, we have graham crackers, cornflakes. So Dr. Kellogg did the same thing. He created cornflakes just like Dr. Graham did. He created cornflakes as a unnutritious food that could be fed to, adolescents and boys to lower their sex drive. Again, trying to control masturbation. There's also all these developments of like different mechanisms and different contraptions that like little boys would wear. So there's one that's like a straight jacket that ties the child's hands down, or it can go over the private area while they sleep so that they don't masturbate. There's this like medieval torture device one that the book also talks about, that is basically like a ring, and then it has like these metal points in the ring, and you put it over the penis, and so if the boy gets an erection during the night, it'll actually push against the little spikes, therefore he would lose the erection, because we used to believe that nocturnal erections are somehow a symbol of sexual desire, and we're trying to limit the sexual desire of men. There's all these things, and that little ring was actually sold in the Sears catalog in like the 50s. Okay, so there is a long-standing history of trying to control sexuality, both men and women. Now, again, back even further than the 50s, many people believed that only men had strong sexual drives, not women. Okay, so once we actually discovered that like women also have sexual drives, then it became this issue of like trying to control female sexuality, now that we understand that. But before that, we just thought women don't have sexual drives, and even if they display it, we're going to control it as much as we can. That's kind of the way that the world and even the United States like thought about female sexuality. So we can actually thank Dr. Kinsey for bringing more light to female sexuality. All right, Dr. Alfred Kinsey. So, masturbation is highly common. All right, as I said, it can be solo, it can be with a partner, it can be a partner watching, it can be multiple things. Right. This week's discussion. There's a list of questions that I'm giving you. You're going to pick two and talk about them. Some of them have to do with masturbation, such as like, what if you caught your roommate masturbating? What would you do? Or what if you caught your child masturbating? What would you do? Right? Those types of questions. They're very good questions to look through and answer. So make sure you do your discussion for this week. Next is erotic touching. All right. So we also call this like heavy petting, right? But it's really, it can be just touching of the body, anywhere on the body, right? Touching of the breasts, touching of the genitals, right? For some people, it might be that like feet are what like they're sexually attracted to. So it could be touching of the feet, right? It can be a number of things, but the erotic touching is sensual touching of the body, okay? From one partner to the next, or even of themselves. All right, so that's another sexual behavior that is quite common as well. Okay, then there is oral sex, all right, which is also a common sexual behavior. If you look at that sheet, more men fantasize about receiving oral sex than women do. Oftentimes, women do not receive as much oral sex as men do. So it's an interesting sexual behavior. Okay, now we call cunnilingus, so that's like female receiving oral sex, and then fellatio is male receiving oral sex. Okay, and so those are the two words that we actually use for oral sex. Just something to throw out there. I know we haven't really talked about like STDs or anything like that, but please be aware that oral sex, you can still contract certain STDs even through oral sex. Okay, oftentimes many people don't realize that they can, but you can. There's a swapping of fluids that's occurring, so you can contract certain STDs through oral sex. So make sure you keep that in mind, okay? So when we talk about STDs and stuff like that, like a big thing is that I'm going to really press on you is you got to be aware and you got to be very cautious and you got to protect yourself, okay? Now, there's also anal stimulation, all right, which is also a common sexual behavior. So anal intercourse, which is basically like anal penetration, which should always be done with some form of lube. Avoid any type of doling lube when when having anal intercourse, all right, because the doling sensation lube is going to cause problems. Avoid anything that has any type of like heating up mechanism or anything like that, because the anus does not really respond well to that type of stuff, okay? Make sure it's a quality lube when engaging in anal intercourse. Okay, especially when using a condom, make sure the condom is compatible with the lube you're using. Oil-based, water-based lube is one of the best lubes to use when using a condom for any form of sexual intercourse, okay? When using lubricants. So when using a condom, water-based is one of the best. Analingus, which is going to be, eating of the butt, I guess you could say. I'm trying to use like nice language here, all right? But analingus is basically it's oral sex of the anus, okay? So also another thing, be careful with that, all right? So because there is like this bacteria in the anus from feces, there can be some transferring of things from that too. Okay, so please be careful with these things. All right. When we talk more about STDs, I can talk more about how anal stimulation or anal intercourse is actually one of the fastest ways of transmitting HIV. Okay, now that doesn't mean that like HIV just is created through anal intercourse. That's not how it is. Yes, there's bacteria in the anus, but that's not how HIV is created, okay? HIV is a virus that somebody has, but one of the easiest ways to spread it is through anal intercourse. And it's due to a lot of mechanisms with the body and so on, and then if there's any type of bleeding that may occur. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on, and that's why there's a high level of transmitting through anal intercourse, okay? Now, HIV is not, and I talk about this again in STDs, but it is not a homosexual disease, okay? It's not. All right, so get that out of your head. In fact, the number one way that HIV is actually being transmitted currently is through heterosexual intercourse. Okay? And when I say heterosexual intercourse, I'm really just saying male-female intercourse. That's actually the number one mode of transmission currently. Okay, so it is not this disease that only is only affecting the homosexual community. No. It's actually affecting the heterosexual community much more in today's age. Okay? And there are reasons for that, and I'll talk about that when I talk about STDs. All right? And then there's coitus. So the book refers to coitus as heterosexual sex. So we're talking male to female. All right? And it gives very specific positions and so on and so on. I don't really like to define terms necessarily in that way. I try not to do that because I don't like those types of labels. But coitus is really just, that's the higher sexual activity, right? So we're talking about penetration from the penis into the body in some way. Okay, that's really how I'm thinking of coitus. I hope that's how you think of coitus as well. All right, now when we talk about coitus, there's multiple different positions with coitus. The book talks about 4 main ones, but there are tons of other positions, especially if you get into things like Kama Sutra and so on. Some are not that easy to achieve, but the easier ones to achieve are going to be like entry from the bottom, okay, which is basically that the one who is doing the penetrating is on the bottom, okay? And then the one who is being penetrated is on the top, okay? That's one way of thinking about the entry from entry from bottom, which the book refers to as woman on top, okay? But I'm calling it entry from the bottom. Entry from top is where the individual who is penetrating is on the top. The individual who is being penetrated is on the bottom, okay? You with me? Good. Rear entry is that the individual who is doing the penetrating is behind the individual who is being penetrated, okay? Coitus, one more time, is penetrative sex, okay? So, and then there is side by side, where both individuals are just laying side by side, okay? And basically the penetration is happening from the person who is behind but next to the person who is being penetrated. Okay? So this is very quickly, I mean, there's a lot of sexual behaviors and there's differences in sexual behaviors and among vast different cultures, right? So there's a difference of sexual behaviors from men to women. There's a difference of sexual behaviors between heterosexual and homosexual. There's a difference of behaviors between, let's say, white culture and Hispanic culture. So there's just a lot of differences between cultures. Some of the articles, I posted some articles through the module, and some of the articles talk about some of these differences between sexual behaviors. There's a difference of sexual behaviors between religions or non-religious individuals, and so there's a lot of information about sexual behaviors. It's hard to just cover all of that, so it's really just trying to narrow it down to some common sexual behaviors that are seen among different cultures. There was another thing I wanted to say. Oh, yes. So when it comes to research, one of the things that's very interesting, but yet I understand it, is that research nowadays, well, actually, a lot of the research that we have about sexual behaviors really focuses just on like heterosexual behaviors, okay? Heterosexual sexual behaviors. So it doesn't really look at a lot of homosexual sexual behaviors. And so we don't have a lot of research about that at this time. Things are changing, but they're not changing as fast as, you know, some people would like, such as myself, okay? We also don't have a lot of research about sexual behaviors for something like oral sex or even anal stimulation or anal sex, okay? We don't have a lot of research on that either. We have a vast amount of research on heterosexual sex, but or coitus, heterosexual coitus, right? So, which is the penetrative part. We do have a lot of research on that, but we're missing a lot of research on these other things, right? Even on masturbation, we have some research, but it's not as vast as heterosexual coitus is. So just something to keep in mind, and maybe even ask yourself like some critical thinking questions, such as, why is that? How come we don't have enough research on these things, right? How come there is like almost no research on homosexual sexual behaviors, right? And so those types of questions are the questions that we need to be asking, especially among the research community and the educational community, because we need to be opening up and looking at more of the different cultures, okay? So just something to think about, food for thought, you know, stuff like that. So you also have an exam this week, so make sure you complete your exam. Make sure you complete your discussion board.